Hello! Okay, so in case you don't know me and you're watching this, my name is James. I am a freelance knitting tech editor, which means that I edit knitting patterns. And hi there! Yay! It still amazes me every time I do Periscope and it pops up saying people are watching. It's just like, oh my god, that's amazing! And hearts and everything. So the idea, behind the video today is just to have a quick chat about my last post, um, which is has the same title as this, which is just how to reduce the number of queries, your pattern kits. And the idea behind this was I talked a bit about how to do some editing of your own work already, but I kind of thought that specifically one of the things that I was always curious about was how much or how often or how much feedback designers get from their customers about how difficult the pattern is, or whether they get questions that actually could have been answered in the pattern before they happened. So the idea here is that by spending some time working on the pattern before it goes live, you get fewer people contacting you asking questions, and therefore you don't have to do any more work than putting the pattern together, and then people kind of come to trust that your patterns will have all the information in them, and that they know what the answer is, and that they don't have to worry too much, and that they can just pick up a pattern of yours and get on with it. So I thought that'd be kind of a cool thing to look at. And the gist of what I wrote about was to do with how you communicate the information in your pattern. So there's obviously the basic standard stuff, which is all to do with thank you for inviting followers. The basic stuff is all to do with sort of your K2 togethers, your this is how you write out knitting instructions. It's the kind of stuff that's pretty much standard across the board. And then it's about how you present your information in such a way that it makes sense to somebody who just picks it up and doesn't know what's already in your head and doesn't know the design already. So a couple of the things that I mentioned were things like having a really good photograph of the pattern, which isn't so much about making it look pretty, but is actually about making the image transfer a lot of information about how it's put together, what it's supposed to look like, how it works, to the knitter without having to use a lot of language. So it's this idea of a picture paints 1,000 words kind of thing. And sometimes the only photos that I'll see about a design will be a modelled shot or what have you, or this beautiful artistic photograph in which the knitted piece is draped or folded or sort of tussled up in such a way as it looks amazing, and it's a beautiful, beautiful marketing photo. But as a knitter, it does me no good to check that actually I'm making what I think I'm making. So I think it's really useful to have at least one photo where you can just kind of see the pattern or the colour changes or whatever it is that's interesting about this design, and I can just see it really, really clearly. I'm just trying to think what I was going to talk about now. The gist of what I wanted to suggest was that if you spend some time thinking about how your pattern's going to be read, then you enable yourself to check that what is on the page is going to make sense to somebody. And when you get somebody else to read your patterns for you, they can often tell you, okay, well, what does this mean? Or I think it's going to do this, but is that right? And so so it's useful. I'm burbling a little bit now, I apologise. So another thing that I think is really useful is to look at how you lay out the actual pattern itself. And for this, I drew on some of the stuff that I posted on Instagram recently, actually, a load of design books that I read a while back. and they talk about things like Gestalt principles of design and all these kind of fancy terms. But basically, the idea is where you put the information on the page in the pattern makes a difference as to where someone's going to look, the order in which they're going to look at it, and what they're going to associate, what they're going to think there's going to be connections between. So if you put a note up at the very top of a page that kind of says something about, the decreases in this pattern are going to be done in this particular way, some kind of little tweaky note that you think is going to be important, but then the decreases don't actually happen until halfway down that page, or on the other side of the page, or even on the next page, then that's an exaggerated example, but the idea here is that the way that it's laid out is not helping people make a connection between this note and when the information is relevant. So sometimes you might be better off repeating the information a couple of times so that it's always right next to where it's relevant. If it, say, happens 2 or 3 times over a whole pattern, so it's sparsely populated, and you just kind of go, right, here, here, and here, these are the key places, even though it's repeated. Apologies for things making random noises in the background. And if it's something that applies to the whole pattern, like a particular construction or a particular way of doing a particular stitch, then it wants to be somewhere that's easily referenced. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. One is you kind of, which is fairly standard, is you kind of have a section near the beginning of the pattern that's kind of, these are all the different techniques that we use, and here's a little explanation of this one, here's a little explanation of this one, here's a little explanation of this one. And if they're used all the way through the pattern, that kind of makes sense, because you don't want to just be repeating it all the time. You just be like, no, stick it right at the beginning, and then actually it's used often enough that after a couple of times, then people will be used to doing it and they won't need to refer back to it anyway. If, on the other hand, it's something that's only used, say, in the cuff, right at the end of the pattern, then having the explanation right at the beginning of the pattern, now my printer's joining in and making noises, having the information right at the beginning of the pattern is not necessarily the most useful place to have it. Whereas if in the explanation of how you make the cuff, you say have a little box that can be highlighted in some way or outlined or what have you, that just kind of goes, this is the technique for the cuff, then actually it's not like when I read through the pattern, because when I read through a pattern that has a load of explanations at the beginning, I basically skip them, look at the pattern and then go back and kind of read them and try and think, right, well, this is happening here and this is happening here and this is, but I'm doing a lot of mental work. How you lay out your pattern and how you present the information can massively reduce the amount of mental work the knitter's going to have to do, and by doing that you limit the number of queries that people might need to make of you, kind of coming back to you and going, what's this? And more importantly, you limit the number of queries that people have with your pattern that they never tell you about, because what's really common is that people will sort of stumble through a pattern and they'll get it in the end, and so it'd be like, yeah, I've made this thing and this is great, and maybe other people will kind of ask, oh, what's that? And they'll tell them the pattern, but they might not be like, oh my gosh, you have to make this, it's amazing and it's just so easy to do. The that's something that I hear when people are talking about patterns, is like, oh, this one's just great, the pattern's really well written and you don't have to, it's just really easy, you pick it up and you get on with it. And sometimes how you lay out your pattern, even if it's all the same information, how you lay out your pattern will make the difference between a pattern that is correct and a pattern that is amazing and that people really, really love. So it's starting to think about things like not only what information is in my pattern, but where do I put that information? So something like gauge is pretty much always going to be near the beginning of your pattern, because one of the first things that someone wants to do, particularly for something like a sweater or what have you, or maybe socks. If if you don't know already, you just do so many stitches on such and such a needle. If you haven't got to the place where you do that automatically, then you need to do the gauge before you start getting into the pattern. But actually, you could get quite creative about the rest of the layout. When does somebody need to know this information? Do they need to know about this technique at the beginning of the pattern, or can you put it when it's relevant? Do they need to know that they're going to need 4 stitch markers right at the beginning? Well, yes, I suppose if they're wanting to put a kit together to put it in their little project bag, that makes sense, so that's fine. But then maybe further down at the beginning of a section, you put something that kind of goes, this section uses the stitch markers, or something like that. And you could even have a little icon so that people kind of look at that and go, oh, right, okay, this section uses, this is where the stitch markers are going to be used and stuff. So there's all kinds of really clever ways that you could actually get into presenting the information in your pattern, so that not only is it accurate and technically correct, but people can understand it much more easily, and it's presented in the way that they're going to read it. So there's this idea in the article I talk about the fact we read from left to right, from top to bottom, and in columns. Then if it's like laid out like a magazine or what have you, and so you can think about, well, highlighted information like a little box to one side can be out of the way if it's eye-catching and will draw attention, so that somebody knows it's there and they can refer to it when it's relevant. But you can put less intrusive information in line, as it were, in with the instructions. So that's things like how you put in stitch counts and what have you. They'll usually be done in line, and it's usually kind of something like little brackets at the end or what have you. But the way that you put that information in, how is it useful for the knitter? I mean, yes, you want to have sort of just a general check in there, but you could think about, well, which stitch counts are useful. So if you've got a pattern that, say, has some stitch markers involved, so it's do X up to the stitch marker, say it's like a cabled sweater front, so you knit so far across until the marker in a basic pattern, then you start to do the stitch, and then you start to do the basic again. You could just say there is 120 stitches across the chest, or whatever it would be, or round the chest. Depends on what your gauge is. But as a knitter, it might be like, well, oh, right, okay, so to make sure that I'm right, I have to sit and count all 120 stitches. Whereas if there's nothing really going on the outside of the markers, it's just plain stitches at the sides, and then there's something interesting like cables and what have you going on in the middle, then maybe it's useful to kind of go, the stitch count outside of the markers is always X, and then at whatever point I can just check, yeah, okay, that's right. And then between the markers it does this, and maybe there's some decreasing or increasing, what have you, and so all the knitter's having to check is a shorter amount of space. It's much quicker to do, it's much easier to do, and it doesn't feel like someone's saying, well, if you want to be right, you've got to count all 120 stitches, and it becomes, if you just want to check that you're doing this right, you should have 20 stitches between those markers, and I can just go, oh yeah, that's right. So anyway, I've burbled on for a bit. I just wanted to have a bit of a chat and sort of put up a video to go with the article, and it just means that if anybody catches this live, you can ask questions and stuff if there's anything that pops into your head. So thank you for the hearts and what have you for you guys that have popped in, and I will I will stick this up on YouTube as well. So if you don't catch this on Periscope, or if you don't catch all of it on Periscope, it'll be on YouTube as well, and there will always be a link from my blog to the post, and from the blog to the video, and from the video to the blog and everything. So it's all going to be connected, so you'll be able to find everything anyway. So yeah, barring any questions popping up on the screen in the next 2 seconds or 30 seconds, or what's in between there, 5 seconds, then I'm going to sign off and say thank you very much. And yeah, I shall do another one of these next week again for the next article. I'm trying to do them weekly at the moment, and if they seem useful, which it would be lovely to know if these are useful and you want to let me know that they're useful, then I can maybe do them more often, or I could cover subjects that people want to know about. So yeah, just let me know what you guys think. Until then, cheers for now. Bye!